I'll try a few stories and recollections today. I'm going to read some meditations which continue on from last week, because what I got into last week was actually reading you some of the meditations and stories that didn't go into the last two books. You know, you can't fit everything into a book, and sometimes when you're finishing off the book, you have to take things out which you really like, which you think like, oh, it's a pity to lose that, but you have to, because the book can only be a certain size. And so I'm just going to continue reading where I was last week, and I hope you like it. As I say, it's a lovely day here, 15th of December, and it's just lovely. And I'm on my own in this little room, the fire going. But you know something? The fire I have at the moment is an electric fire that flickers. And it's not an expensive one. I bought it for about €100. I bought it 2 or 3 years ago, and it still functions. It's like a little candle. You know, once you see the flicker, I'm happy. And on the other side of me on the wall, I have my favourite icons, the Christ of Sinai and the Kazan Mother of God. They're two beautiful icons, and in between them I have a little red bowl with a nightlight flickering in that as well. And I got the little bowl. It's a real kind of religious looking thing. It has gold around it and a cross on it. It's a real ornament you'd see in a church, you know. And I got it from the sisters in Minsk. Those wonderful sisters. I went to Minsk in 2019 because miraculously I had survived a heart attack. And the heart attack was on the 8th of December 2018. So the following summer, as an act of gratitude, I went and did a retreat for about a week in a convent in Minsk. I think I might go back again, because in the meantime I had 2 more operations on the back, and maybe next summer. I'd love to go back to Minsk, but I'd be afraid, you know. It's just because the war in Ukraine means that there's a fracture has developed between East and West. And, you know, the Belarusians are aligned with Russia and we're aligned with Ukraine, and you wonder maybe that would be tricky, getting visas and going into Belarus and all the rest of it. So it's just amazing what war does too, isn't it? It's like a war can destroy things in a second, and the consequences can be years or generations to fix up. And I suppose obviously the same is going on in Gaza. Now there was a friend, somebody who listens every week, and he was saying maybe give us less of the religious reflections for a while and some more of the stories, because he heard me on Sunday Miscellany. And he really liked what he heard on Sunday Miscellany. Well, I thought to myself, what I'll do then is in the next couple of weeks, around the Christmas, I'll put in some Sunday Miscellany stuff that hasn't yet come up on Sunday Miscellany, and I can give you a preview of pieces that I recorded for Sunday Miscellany. And another thing I thought I'd do is, well, I'll go back to this story that I was on last week. So here I am. I'm doing the same thing as I did for 4 years. And it's not really about the content. If you get that, you get me. And I met a man who may be listening this morning or this evening, whenever you're listening, but I met a person, and he's from Donegal, and he's travelled the world. And when he was in far-off countries, he used to listen to the podcast. And he was walking down the street in Donegal yesterday, and he passed me, and he just turned to me, and he said, "Michael, is it?" And it was like we were old friends. You know, he wasn't saying like, "Oh my goodness, is that you?" Or, "I'm sorry for intruding on you, you don't know me." No, he was just saying hello, like 2 friends. And I asked him what he was involved within his life, and he had a really interesting story, which maybe I'll come back to later, but it was just a lovely moment, and it happens again and again when I'm doing tours around the country and I'm doing a gig in an art centre, and somebody comes up to me and they say, I listen to your podcast. Now, when you do that to me, you are enriching my life. I don't understand it, but there's something, a need in me to share my joy, which is based on religious faith. Like your joy is your joy, and you share your joy with your family, and sometimes your joy comes from the fact that your family are together, the fact that you get a new car, or you get a new suit, or you get a new pair of trousers, or, there's little material things that make us joyful. There's forgiveness makes us joyful. There's beautiful love among families that make us joyful. But there's something, I can never get away from it, and that's why I keep coming back to it in podcasts. And so you'll have to bear with me and forgive me for being so obsessive about religion. But I'm still convinced there's something here to be said again and again. And it's this, that there is a joy inside you. There's a joy that's like private to you, which is essentially about being alive. And that's to do with religious faith. And I think no matter what pathway you use, be it Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, it doesn't matter as much as that you find a pathway, that you find a language that allows you to experience your own inner joy. Because when you experience this joy, it's like experiencing truly that there is somebody else within you. There is a deeper being holding you and loving you and sustaining you, even if you're ill, even if you're in hospital, even if you're bereaved, even if the most appalling tragedy has happened to you. And it's a radical, crazy, mad message. But I don't know of any situation where I haven't found a sense of comfort and consolation in that. And this is what the podcast is about. It's about sharing that with you. And thinking about you as an individual who is present to me in this moment. My dear friend, my dear, dear friend, I think about you. I can't put a name on you. You're not here in this present moment, but you are there in your own present moment, and you're listening to my heart beating with you. And the fact that we both share this sense of an inner joy that can only be expressed as faith. It can only be expressed as prayer. And that's all. That's why I do the podcast. It's to share that experience rather than share the stories. The stories are like, they're my art. I'm a storyteller. So it's like if I was a musician, I'd be singing songs. If I was a painter, I'd be painting pictures. But I paint word pictures. I tell stories. I gather them from my experience and I share them. And I try and share them as well as I can. So that's what I do. It's like the tracks of the animal. It's what I leave behind me in my wake, or a couple of stories, But it's my presence in the world that mystifies me. And it is in my presence, in being here and being now, that I find this extraordinary sense of joy. And sometimes I do feel like my anxieties about money and health and aging and pain and loneliness and the people that I don't get on with or who are angry with me or whatever, all those sometimes feel like layers of concrete above my head pressing me down. And every move I make, every word I speak, sometimes feels like trying to justify my existence in the face of this onslaught of cement being pressed down on me in my soul. And I feel like that. You feel like that. Every human being has those moments. We call them moments of darkness. But when I practice some form of prayerfulness, when I close the door in that little room in the heart, when I try to listen to what it is just to be here now, it's like in the silence I feel a voice. And it's like a well pushing up and just dissipating all that weight of cement that is pressing down on me. It's like an eruption that, a well of living waters just rising up inside me, and this sense of cement weight, anxiety, worry, concern, fear, loneliness, it just starts to dissipate. So it's not an alternative to suffering or having a bad day. Prayer is not the alternative, but it's what I do when I'm having a bad day. And if I can do it well, I get there. I've never had an experience. The problem is getting into it. The problem is, how do you physically trigger in time and space that sense of your own inner world? And some of the tricks that I use are things like lighting candles, going for a walk on my own, sitting still and meditating, listening to music, and very often just being still physically. And those are tricks. And sometimes I go into a church and I sit and be still, and I don't go in with any rigmarole of intention. I simply go in with a sense of time. I will spend 5 minutes. 5 minutes can feel an awful long time. But yet if you do 5 minutes, let's say 5 minutes, when it's finished, seems like a short time. You go into a church and you're sitting there and you've told yourself, I'll go in the doors, I'll sit in a pew and I won't do anything else. I'll just sit there for 5 minutes. And you feel an hour has passed and you look at your watch and 2 minutes has passed, right? But then you say, no, let's do this. I'm going to sit here passively for 5 minutes. I'm going to keep my body still and just be focused on the little red flickering lamp way in the distance on the altar. And you do that, and you will fall into heaven. As Shane MacGowan, as the song says, some of us fell into heaven, some of us fell into hell. And I think that's the trick. So that's why I do the podcast. I do it for the joy that I have and for the joy that I share with you, and which I can do nowhere else I can't do that if I'm writing a column in the newspaper. I can't do it if I'm writing a book. I can't do it if I'm on stage and I'm touring. Those are all moments which are comedic, which are fun, which are reflective. I can't do it when I'm on television. But it's what makes this podcast for me very special. And so I'm just going to continue reading some of the meditation that I was on last week. I'm fond of hearing voices in the silence and of imagining the world revealing itself in the accidental chirping of a bird, or the way light in Leitrim can sneak out of the clouds when you least expect it. And because we live high up, we have snow when others have none. Now, one Christmas we arranged the house as usual, and I put up the crib in the usual spot under the tree, the one I bought in Arizona, a little crib I bought many, many years ago in 1987, or maybe 1989, with little figures that look like they were born on the Navajo reservation, in white clothes and long black hair, all standing around gazing at the infant in the straw. The crib was always important to me. It was at the crib that I got my vocation many years ago. I was in the hall of our house as a child, watching the shadows move when I moved the torch behind the crib to light up different figures. And it was as if the angel stepped down the stairs behind me and touched my shoulder. I remembered the moment clearly. I had the little torch in my hand, and it was like I was a theatre designer, So I had the little crib and the little figures in it, and I was moving the light around to get nice, spotlight images of the little figures. And then there was this sense that there was somebody walking down the stairs behind me. I can't remember, but I'm certain that he came to me, that he touched me, that he gave me goosebumps, and then dissolved. He was like the fella on the roof of the crib. He was a messenger from God, though I couldn't figure out what the message was at that early stage. And I suppose because there were so many angels in Christmas, there was angels always singing, "Peace to men of goodwill." Men now generically meaning women and men and children. Peace to all humanity. It wasn't like a narrow religious proclamation of, peace to the Christians, or peace to the Jews, or peace to those who follow this guy. No, it was just peace. It was just peace. And that's what I was talking about earlier, I think. When I talk about the joy that's inside you, when I talk about like anxiety and worry about money and worry about health, it's like cement pushing down on your heart. And then you get this, if you go in there, if you go into the heart and just try and experience God's presence, you find peace, you find heaven, you fall into heaven. It's a magnificent presence, and it's in you, it's in your heart, and that is your happy Christmas. And that's my gift to you this Christmas, to say to you that within you is the blessing of God. Within your own heart is the presence of being in heaven. No matter how difficult life is on the surface. Well, when I was young, I didn't understand how to articulate that like I might now. But I certainly felt, and I'm looking at the crib, remember, I'm looking at the little baby Jesus, and I'm looking at the little angels, little figurines that you'd put on the top, on the roof of the crib. There was a little straw roof on the crib we had. And then suddenly it was like this presence was coming down the stairs. It was like, do you know the way I'd be aware, even though you have your back to the stairs, but you would know when your father or your mother or somebody in the house was coming down the stairs. You'd be aware of them even though you're not looking at them. I was aware of somebody coming down the stairs, and I knew it wasn't my father, my mother. Nobody in my family was upstairs. Yet there was this presence coming down the stairs. And it touched me. I felt it was the angel. And then it dissolved. But later I found his presence in other places. Often when I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, or out the window at the clouds, I could feel his presence. And the feeling that this presence induced in me was one of gladness. It felt delicious to be alive. And I felt as if I was in company. That's the only way I can explain it. Later, still, when I was allowed to serve Mass in the cathedral, I could feel his presence when the bells rang at the consecration of the Mass. The bells used to tingle. The bell itself was 3 bells all sort of welded together. They were kind of a brass ornament. And there was 3 bells and 3 little, things in it. And you just shook the bell and the 3 things rang. So what you got was a jingle of bells. The 3 bells together were jingling. And I always used to think that sound was like the sound of angels. Maybe because, it came after the prayer, Holy, holy, holy Lord God of hosts, heaven and earth are full of your glory, Hosanna in the highest. So there was this idea that angels were singing praise to God in God's presence. And that's like a huge idea that's the nature of angelic life. That life beyond our life that is disembodied in some way in the cosmos as a presence, as a conscious presence, is just constantly singing glory to God. And it doesn't embody, it's a presence, angelic presence that manifests as light. As light is always associated with angels. And I do often think nowadays when scientists are talking about, quantum energy and light and sort of hidden realities beyond what we experience as matter, I often think to myself, well, it's not too far away from what the old Bible was saying about angels. That sense of, and that they're singing praise is something that, we're in this embodied state and we have to struggle with stuff, right? But in liturgy or in prayer, or when you're feeling happy, when you're having a good moment, it's like your heart begins to sing praise to God. And when you're singing praise to God, you're connected and one with angelic life. There are 1,000,000 angel beings all around you, and you're singing in the choir. And that's a pretty cool idea for a young boy when you're on the altar ringing the bells. And because the bells always ring at that moment, Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus, Sabaoth, Holy, Holy, Holy. Because the bells used to ring at that moment, it was like, well, you could hear the angels in the bells. It was like their voices. It was those tingling sounds felt like these were vibrations that in some way were channeling the presence of angels. And it's a really funny thing, but so many years later, I'm in a Tibetan prayer hall, and I'm holding Tibetan bells. And I'm making the beautiful sound. I'm touching one bell off the other. Tibetan bells are like two discs on a string, on a thin rope. And you just touch one with the other, and you get this vibration of beautiful sound. And again, you do it at the beginning of a ritual because it opens up the vibrations, herald in the transcendent, the presence of bodhisattvas and dakinis and all sorts of Buddhas. It's like opening the gates of our material reality to some deeper metaphysical reality which is beyond it. And we use bells in Tibetan practice, in Christian practice, to create the vibration that becomes the ritual, liturgical opening of that door. So as a child I would hear in those bells this wonderful presence of angels. The priest bent over the bread on the altar before me as I knelt on the lower step, with my hands joined, and the boy beside me took up the bells, a kind of umbrella of 4 small bells, and shook it so that it tinkled, just as the priest whispered, "Hoc est enim corpus meum." This is my body. It was the tinkling bell that was his presence for me. And other times when the choir sang in the gallery behind me, I could hear him in their voices. You see, it was like a stranger following me down the years from early childhood, coming down the stairs, floating around in the ether when the bells would tingle. And then even in the choir, I'd have this sense that, like, there's somebody there. And it wasn't like a ghost. It wasn't like a fearful thing. It wasn't like a dark presence that might be like a nasty stranger. It was like, if I could find that person, it would be like stronger than wanting to find your mammy. I remember, I got lost from the mother one time in Dublin in Cleary's, and I was standing for a long time and I lost her, and I was quite distressed. I knew her presence was out there in the crowds, Dunleary, or not Dunleary, Cleary's, on O'Connell Street. There was huge crowds in it in the old days, and they used to pass. The money from the counters used to go to a central kiosk on wires. So there was these strange cylinders. When somebody wanted to purchase something, the money was put in the cylinder. The cylinder was hooked onto a wire, and by some mechanical means it flew across the ceiling to a kiosk. And then the money was taken, the change was put in, and the cylinder came back to the counter. So it was quite a frightening place. Never mind that from a country town like Cavan, this was Dublin, this was like hundreds of people, and I lost my mammy. But I knew she was in there, in that crowd. I could feel her presence until she found me. And that sense of the angelic presence was kind of similar, only more intense. I would say maybe 1,000 times more intense. There was some presence there that I couldn't touch, but was present. It was there. And I knew it was an angel because my mother had told me that everyone has a special angel who walks with them to protect them. That was fine. Until I was in senior class in primary school, and I was taught by the saintly brother Timothy, with a soft, gentle smile and a compassionate heart. because he always frowned whenever some of the other brothers were roaring at the top of their lungs in black temper down the corridor, beating some poor unfortunate child for not knowing certain details of Irish grammar. There was rough times in the Brothers de la Salle school in Cavan, rough times and brutal teachers. But there was one brother, Timothy. He would shake his head and frown at the blackboard, sometimes leaning into it as if in despair, until the roaring stopped. And Brother Timothy, he died during the year, by the way, but he taught me to pray. He said that if you say a certain prayer every hour, you'll always be in God's presence. And the simple prayer was, let us remember that we are in the presence of God. You said that and you stayed still for about 60 seconds. And we used to do that in class, and that was the prayer. So we said it every hour, and then for a minute or two the entire class was silent. I noticed that at other times of enforced silence, certain boys would giggle or act the maggot, but never after this prayer. It was as if we were being watched, and I came to love that silence. And sometimes when I wasn't in school, I would say it to myself. Sometimes when there was an argument in the house, or when I was out under the trees at Killikeen, I would say, let us remember we are in the presence of God. And I'd wait, and sure enough I could feel a certain presence in the house, in the shadows, in the trees, in the lake. Wherever I was in the presence of God. I didn't quite know what the word God meant, or what the word presence meant, but I was happy because I could intuit it. I had a feeling inside me of gladness in that moment, and that seemed right. And it's amazing the way language works, for children, for young people. There's a notion, I think, nowadays that the understanding comes before the language. So people say, well, I wouldn't teach my child that because they wouldn't understand it yet. But they're never going to understand it until they say it. And I think that the old way was much better, where a child, we learned off prayers that even now, as an old man, I'm still grappling with the meaning of the words. But the fact that we learned the prayer and didn't know what we were saying wasn't nonsense. It was the way that the meaning was born in us. So if I said, as a very young 7-year-old child, a most profound prayer, which is the act of contrition, says, "Oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended you. And I detest my failure above every other evil because it displeases you. And you're so deserving of all my love. And so I firmly resolve never more to offend you and to amend my life." Now, the level of complex psychological ideas in that prayer, the way that it fits a Buddhist sense of complete renunciation, complete letting go of the self and abandonment in the face of that greater presence that inhabits all of us, which the Buddhists might call enlightenment and which Christians might call a state of grace. That prayer contains the architecture linguistically to hold those ideas together. But I didn't know that when I was 7. However, by learning it when I was 7, by practicing it, and sometimes using it, sometimes in confession, sometimes just when I felt bad and alone and I wanted to do something to feel good again, and so you could say that act of contrition, or sometimes when you were afraid, when you were terrified, like you were going to die or something, and that used to happen as children as well. You'd fall out of a tree. I remember falling out of a tree, and I was lying on my back on the ground, and I was wondering, is this it? Am I going to die? And children do have those big experiences, even in their little lives. And there's no way you can protect them against it. Sometimes protecting the child is only mollycoddling the child, because they're going to have those experiences as they grow. You know, as they become aware as young children to teenagers, they're going to have experiences about mortality. They're going to have those moments that think, oh my God, am I going to die? And they have them very simply. They see the pet cat dying. I saw my little cat going to sleep. I found it with the vet. I was very traumatized. And sometimes a pet dying is the first way that a young child will learn about death. But then they're going to be in fearful situations, and they don't know that it's not that fearful. You know, sometimes a teacher frowns at them and they think he's going to kill me. And for a moment they're going through that trauma. And I remember, as I said, falling off a tree, and you'd be lying there thinking you're going to die, and you'd be saying, about to say an act of contrition. But you were resolving your soul. You were resolving. You were cleaning out any negative karmic energy in you so that you could allow yourself to be embraced by the great creator of all reality. I mean, I remember one day, this was all going on when I was in primary school, but one day a strange brother came to the school to speak with the senior boys, and he said that if you had ever felt certain glad tidings when you think of God, then you had a vocation. A vocation was a calling. Again, the word would be given to a child, and the child would say, oh, I think I have a vocation. They wouldn't know what the word meant. But in some way, the idea contained in the word was like the growth inside the seed. Once you swallowed the word and made the word your own, in a strange way, the wisdom within the word, the idea of what the word meant, actually grew in you. So I thought a vocation was some kind of calling, and it was an angel coming to take you away to where you would be happy forever with God. And he really, this teacher, this brother, he really pleaded with us. You know, he took off his glasses and his eyes were watering as he told us how happy he was and what a wonderful life he had enjoyed just being in the presence of God. And how lucky we were if any of us had ever had that little voice of an angel, as he called it, inviting us to be in God's presence forever. Well, that seemed just the thing for me. Like how, what did you have to disagree with there? You know, that's like, huh? You start like just with Christmas and you're thinking, oh, the angels. And then you have this moment, which is an intense moment of feeling a presence beyond yourself. This is not superstitious, because I often quote Iris Murdoch on the same experience. It's the experience of when you are enraptured by something outside your own ego, outside your own self, when there is some sense of a greater construct as being the centre of the presence that is in you. And it's moving through you, so that you experience it like as other. You experience it as there's someone coming down the stairs. And it's not threatening. It's like, as I say, it's as good as desiring your mother. And that grows in those old days when we used to do things like serve mass as little boys. And the girls weren't allowed to do it, and that was wrong. That was how unenlightened we were in our culture at that time. But at the same time, it didn't mean that what we were doing should be stopped. It was like, let everybody have this experience. If serving mass reinforces a sense of the sacred, of a presence, of God's presence. But I was lucky. I was very lucky with those accidental moments. And I was very lucky that there was this particular brother, as I say, Brother Timothy, because the childhood experiences you have of faith, I think you can never get away from. And I'd be worried sometimes that maybe you can never get beyond them, you know. So I'm always calm about the possibility that everything I say about faith is simply that I'm trapped in limited experiences, and that my limited experiences make me the person I am. Doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me if all that I'm saying at a philosophical level is not true. It's still me living my free life and enjoying it. So you don't have to be right about religion. I think that was one of the biggest discoveries I made. Probably it took me until my 40s. Probably it took me until I began to look at Buddhist practice, where the Heart Sutra says the ultimate teaching is there is no teaching. In other words, always keep your mind open. Always keep your mind open to the possibility that the way you're naming the world is only the way you're naming it. It doesn't have an objective truth that you can sort of squeeze your fist around and say, I have the truth. You must follow the way I do it. It doesn't have to be like that. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. It's still how I grew as a child, and how I discovered the presence of God. And one of the lucky things as well, maybe, was that moment where I got a connection with this brother who came in and he was talking about vocations. And it fitted the pattern of my experience. I was about 9 years of age, or 10. And the next day, I was taken out of class. Because, well, it happened like this. He suggested, you see, when he was talking to us, that we should fill in a sheet of paper saying yes or no to certain questions about God's presence in our lives. And I was no time filling it out at all. I was going, yes, oh yeah. I've felt God's presence in this, that, and the other. Well, the next day, I was taken out of class, and I spoke to this strange brother on my own in a small office with a glass door and a lot of copybooks. He leaned over me and I could smell tobacco off his breath, and he said that maybe I should speak to my parents about the possibility of going away with him to somewhere in the Midlands where I would train to be a brother, like Timothy, and be professed into the congregation and be happy forever with God. Now, it's almost hard for us to believe now that this went on. In other words, that children were taken at 12 years of age when they were finished primary school, and instead of going to an ordinary secondary school. They sometimes went to do their secondary education in a religious institution within which they were, if you like, groomed into the religious order, and then found themselves at 18 years of age actually taking vows and becoming a Christian brother. It just seems so strange to us now. But if you go back even another 40 years earlier, you'll find that nearly all the secondary schools were doing the same thing. Not nearly all of them, but many of them. The reason being that before 1966, there was no free education. The only people who went to secondary school were the people who could afford to go. And in the old days when the roads were bad and there were no school buses and people didn't have cars at all, you couldn't go to even the secondary school. Even if you had money, you couldn't go unless you went as a boarder. Even if it was 20 miles away, it would be impossible. So people ended up, their children going to secondary schools where there was maybe 150 boarders, and a great majority of them were being funded in that by the church because they were seen as potential material to become priests. So the grooming, if you like, of young people into the church, the clerical church, was going on from the age of about 12. And we forget that. And we forget the damage that would be done in that system, particularly as education improves in the general society. We forget how much narrowness and repression could go on. If you're taking a young kid of 12 and bringing him into a religious institution, and if you like, as I say, grooming him, and I'm using that word provocatively, into a life of service as a cleric or as a Christian brother or as a nun, because this was all done with young women as well. Now what I'm saying is that if you go back further, if you go back 100 years, you realise that this was the way the culture worked. Or if you went to Tibet, you would find this is the way the culture worked. You know, children were brought into institutional religious life at an age so young that our jaws drop with shock when we think of it. I came at the end of that. I was going through the system in the 60s in primary school. In the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. And that was coming to an end. But yet my experience of that, okay, let me put it this way. My mother didn't think it was a good idea at all. Now, she didn't throw a fit, but the following evening, after I had got this interview with the brother who was looking to encourage boys to become Christian brothers, the following evening she met me at the classroom door, and when all the other boys had left with their little school bags on their back, me and her and brother Timothy had a little chat. Timothy was leaning on the cofra, as I remember it, the press, where the copybooks were held, beside the glass door of the classroom. He was leaning on it, and the word cofra was stuck on the door. And my mother was telling him in fairly relaxed phrases that she thought it was better if I waited until later to answer this vocation. And Timothy was pulling his ear with his thumb and forefinger in a manner that he often did when reflecting, and he smiled and said he agreed. It was far too early, he said. And I always remembered that subtle moment where there was a kind of grooming going on where a young kid could be taken off to a secondary school with the presumption that he would be within the religious system. And yet here was a Christian brother, relaxed, chatting to my mother, and the two of them totally agreeing, well, that'd be a wrong idea. But they weren't actually saying this idea of having a vocation is rubbish. Seemed to be both saying it's too early to be discussing it. And that's the balance. That's the space that stayed alive for me. You know, I forgot about... I was so embarrassed about that moment that I've never really spoken about it until this day. I forgot about it at the time, and I went to secondary school and I had an experience at an adolescent which included all the robust fun and crack you might have, smoking cigarettes and drinking Cav and Cola in the local chip shop, and going to show band and dances and carnivals, and falling into the arms of beautiful young women who were either students in Loreto or the Royal School, or maybe were working in Lisdarn Hospital. That was my life as a teenager, and I forgot this notion of that moment where I was nearly being groomed into whisked away to some institution that... But here's the point. The sense of faith, the sense of the presence coming down the stairs, the magical realism of angelic voices at the Eucharist, all that stuff, it hadn't been smashed, it hadn't been destroyed, it hadn't been ridiculed. I hadn't heard my mother or the brother in question saying, oh yeah, well that's a load of rubbish. That's a bad thing. No, they're just saying, well, not the right time at 12 years of age. So I was carrying then that in my heart for years. Even though for that moment that was the end of it. There was no fighting for my soul, no song and dance from the middle-class mammy about how dare they try to abduct a child for their insane religious life. No. And even that night when my mother was sitting in the dining room on the soft chair with her sewing machine on an upright chair as she darned a sock, she wouldn't be drawn into anger about the incident. She just said that I had all the time in the world to think about those things later. Maybe that's what was so wonderful about her response, and Brother Timothy's response. My little imagination was not damaged. My sense of having a vocation was not destroyed. In fact, it was strengthened. And that's the story of where my vocation came from in human terms. And I suppose when I look back now at 70 years of age, it's recognizing that everything we do is human. And even when we talk about faith, even when we do things at Christmas like engage with the religious side of Christmas, it's human. We're doing something that's human, that we have learned through socialization, through processes of interaction with other human beings. The only thing is that within all the human interactions, if you look at the sociology and the socialization of your life within a context of sociological language, it's like it adds up to more than the bits. It adds up to a sense of design, a sense of shape. And so, having lived a life, being 70 years of age, understanding, in a sense, the secular reality, the scientific reality, the social reality of my life, and all the accidents and all the interplay of stuff that just, almost makes us unfree. There are philosophers who say that there's a determinism within the universe whereby nothing is an accident because everything is always caused by something else. So the whole chain of causality is impelling you to do whatever you do. And so even though you do an action that you think you're free to do, you're really not. So having lived all that, I still feel that within me is this space of God's presence that is alive and well. I still feel that the light, when you come into the solstice and into the most dramatic time of year for light, because all you get is a few hours a day of a slanting sun, it's so delicious, it's so beautiful, but you can't stop thinking of angels when you see the light in the day and you think of the long nights ahead, night after night, right into the end of December. Such a metaphor of God's presence, this angelic light. And all that still creates a space in me that allows me to escape determinism. It allows me to escape secularism. It allows me to escape old age, illness, and depression. And as you know, if you listen to this, I'm old, I've had a few bits of illness, and I've had a few experiences of depression. And yet this sense of faith within me allows me always to go there into that space and be free, and to experience a sense of joy just being alive, even in the shadows, even in the darkness. And that's what Christmas means to me. And a huge part of it is you being here. You are present, and I am present. And there's a third party. And that's the one that connects you and me over time and space. That there is this third element of presence, of being. And it penetrates your heart and my heart. And it's like the Christ is born. Each second, each moment in us. It's Christmas always in your heart. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.